Welcome to Green Building Matters, the podcast that matters for green building professionals. Learn insight in green buildings as we interview today's experts in LEED and WELL. We'll learn from their career paths, war stories, and all things green, because green building matters. And now our host, and yes, he has every LEED and WELL credential. Here's Charlie Cicchetti.
Be sure to check out the Green Building Matters community, where you can have unlimited exam prep for any of the professional credential exams you're tackling next, as well as putting your continuing education on autopilot, saving time with GBS reporting your hours on your behalf. Check it out, gbes.com/join. Now, enjoy this episode of the Green Building Matters podcast.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the next episode of the Green Building Matters podcast. I love my job here because I get to interview really incredible green building professionals and hear more about how they got to where they are. And we talk about what's around the corner, and that's always fun, too. Today, I've got Helen Kessler. She's based out of Chicago. Helen, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Charlie. Glad to be here.
Yeah, thank you for that enthusiasm. We are recording this still in some uncertain times in a pandemic, but I think there's a lot of opportunity I'm sure we'll talk about with healthy buildings and really green buildings continue to thrive. We've got to ask, hey, where'd you grow up and where'd you go to school?
Well, I grew up in Princeton, New Jersey. When I was 14, my family moved to Tucson, Arizona, where my father became a professor of physics at the University of Arizona. I actually lived in Tucson for 18 years and went to high school, college, and worked there.
And I guess that's probably one reason you wanted to go to University of Arizona. So was that just a sure thing? You knew that's where you wanted to go to college?
Actually, it's interesting you asked that. I definitely did not want to go to the University of Arizona, but I ended up going to the University of Arizona by accident, and it's because of that I got into architecture.
Oh, that's a funny story. I know they have a great architecture program, big school, college, and even today they do quite a bit of LEED buildings on campus. So tell us more about that, because I think there's some listening to the podcast here that maybe are curious, which direction should they go? Should they go the design route or maybe another way? So what helped you make that decision?
Well, when I was just started out in architecture, actually, when I started out in college, I thought I might like to become an art major. And of course, the art teacher who who influenced me so much said, don't do that. You can't make any money as an artist. And I said, okay, fine. Well, the first week in college, I met this guy who was a third-year architecture student, and I was so taken by the work he was doing. And he convinced me that I could do architecture. And this was in spite of the thing that I kept thinking about. Well, I didn't study drafting in high school. I don't have the credentials to study architecture. And there were so few women at the time. In fact, the aptitude test that I took didn't even have architecture as an option.
Oh, wow.
The counseling office had a brochure which had a quote by a world-famous architect. I can tell you who that was. It was Pietro Belluschi, who said that architecture was not suitable for girls. And in fact, by the time I graduated, there were 65 graduates and only 5 women. And I think only 2 of us actually stayed in the field.
Wow. I know there's a lot of females in green buildings now, females in architecture. But at the time, was that intimidating or was it motivating for you to overcome that adversity?
Extremely intimidating.
Okay.
It was difficult. And what it meant is that, one had to stand out and excel if one could, because otherwise you're just crushed. I mean, at that time, the idea behind architecture school, in a sense, was let in a lot of people and then kind of get rid of them through attrition.
Oh, geez. No. So, all right. So we get the architecture degree and I got to ask, sustainability, though. Ultimately, you get more into green buildings, but did you grow up sustainability minded? Maybe your family had some influence growing up in that region, or no, it took a little while before you kind of really learned more about sustainability. How was that early influence for sustainability for you?
Well, when I was a third-year architecture student, my father, who, as I said, was a physics professor, invited me to join him and the vice president for research for a tour of the University of Arizona Environmental Research Lab. And this lab had incredibly integrated systems. They used a cogeneration plant to make electricity, used the waste heat to heat greenhouses, used the waste carbon dioxide to help the plants, the veggies grow. And they were growing plants in all different kinds of ways, hydroponic, aeroponic systems. And they were also raising shrimp and looking at how to use the waste from the shrimp for fertilizer. And the lab had started out using solar stills to make distilled water. And the idea behind all this, of course, was to help to grow the desert, so to speak, and build all this in the desert. And there was also a guy who was working on passive solar and a see-through solar collector. And it just was really exciting. And so that was my first introduction to sustainability. Of course, we didn't call it that at that time, but I have to say I was hooked. And I immediately decided I wanted to work at this place, and I ended up doing so for about 7.5 years.
Oh, that's a long time. That's great. Well, tell us about some mentors or some that you really that had influence on you. Who would you look back on and say maybe was a mentor or had influence?
Well, I went to school for a year in London, and I took some classes there in solar. I mean, they were ahead of us at that time in my 4th year in architecture school. And by the time of my 5th year, Larry Medlin had become a professor at the University of Arizona, and he taught the very first solar class in the first solar design studio. So that was really important. Obviously, my father had a huge influence. And interestingly, by the time I started architecture school, he had moved away from the kind of traditional physics to also integrating biology into his work. So I saw how somebody could, be very creative and curious and think outside the box. And other people I would call futurists, like Carl Hodges, who headed the Environmental Research Lab. And I was attracted to people with these big ideas, like Carl, and also James Rouse, who I eventually worked for. And James Rouse was the inventor of festival marketplaces like Faneuil Hall and Quincy Market.
Those are great projects. No, those are great influencers. And then you got to work with some of them and, connect the dots though. Okay, so architecture, get into renewables early, but, what were those next couple steps early in your career? Where were you at and what were you doing?
Oh my gosh, that's such an amazing question, because early in my career, I felt like I was all over the map in a way, because I was interested in solar. I also worked on historic preservation for a number of years and did a preservation study together with one of my professors for Florence, Arizona. And so I was in the solar and the historic preservation. And then eventually I actually got involved in real estate development and went back to school and got an MBA, and I worked in hotel development. So for many years, I sort of looked at my career as kind of having all these disparate parts. And eventually, sometime after the hotel work, everything came together and I started doing consulting in the energy efficiency and sustainability world.
And, LEED, at what point in the career did that come around? And was that just a good tool for you? Was it something that could help carry a conversation you'd already been doing on your projects? When LEED came on the scene, how did that really help?
Well, so you can see that I was working early on in the solar world. And so LEED was amazing when it came to be, because I knew all the people who, and I shouldn't say all, but many of the people who started LEED, and many of them I would call my friends. And I, at the time, it was just a little movement, and solar was a little movement. And all of a sudden with LEED, things just popped, because the whole idea behind LEED was that it would create a market transformation. And I would say that, in fact, it really did that. So LEED became a very important tool. But even for the 12 years or so LEED came to be, I was working in the area of energy efficiency and integrative design. And so I would say that LEED just became something that helped many other people see, oh my gosh, this is something really worth doing now, and could see that benefit, in particular from that market transformation and in fact from the marketing of buildings.
Helen, I love to hear those origin stories because a lot of people don't realize, and to all our listeners here, the U.S. Green Building Council really was formed around 1993, but the first LEED projects weren't coming online until about the year 2000. So you're right, there was a lot of work there in the 90s, late 90s. Sounds like you were hanging out with those folks, and then LEED came on the scene. So, I
will say I worked on actually the very first LEED Platinum municipal building, which was in Chicago, the Chicago Center for Green Technology.
That must have been, if LEED Platinum is still hard today, that must have been really hard to do at the time. But what are a couple features on that early project? What helped it to get to Platinum?
Again, it was a very integrative approach. And then, looking at how all the systems work together, super energy efficiency, there was some solar, photovoltaic. I was responsible for the lighting design, actually, and that was very, very efficient and cutting edge for the time. And then taking a very serious look at the site and how integration of systems in the site and wetlands. And so the whole thing was of a piece. It was, I should mention, it was designed, the lead architect was Doug Farr Associates. And it was really through his vision. He said, the AIA Committee on the Environment in Chicago needs to get involved in a project. We all want to be part of a project. And that project included just about everybody who was on that committee. So that was really formative for all of us, all who were interested in the environment in Chicago, all the architects.
So relationship probably helped launch your career even further and your firm, right? So I definitely want to talk in a minute about some other highlights. But tell us a little more about, the last 17, 18 years and the work you've done at your firm.
Well, I've worked on, I have to say, Charlie, I've been so fortunate to have started my firm. 2003 seemed like a really... the economy wasn't in great shape, but it turns out to have been a great time to have started the firm.
Right.
And so I've worked on well over 80 LEED projects. 12 are LEED Platinum certified.
Amazing.
A lot of my projects are higher education and K through 12. Some of the LEED Platinum projects include a couple at Northwestern University and some school projects. Elementary school and a high school, and a dormitory residence hall at University of Illinois. So one of the things I'm actually quite thrilled about is on some of these LEED Platinum projects that the goal wasn't LEED Platinum, the goal was silver. And we were able to get them not to just LEED Gold, but to Platinum at relatively little or no extra cost.
Wow. 80 projects and counting, and I'm sure you've had a lot of other buildings that weren't necessarily pursuing a LEED certification, but still had so many green attributes. Well, I've got to ask about some other credentials, and then also your business degree, your MBA from Wharton. So has that helped you also? What made you want to go and get that MBA?
Well, I was working at the Environmental Research Lab into the early 1980s, and one other thing I just want to mention, which was quite fun, is I wrote a column for the Arizona Daily Star for 2 years on solar energy and passive solar and energy efficiency. And anyway, so early 1980s, not to get political, but Ronald Reagan was the president. Sure. And one of his first acts was to take the solar collectors off the roof of the White House. And we had grants, big grants from the Department of Energy, which I was working on those grants, and I'm thinking, well, this is not going well. This is not those grants will be gone. And in fact, they were reduced significantly. And so I had been thinking about going into real estate development. And so I looked into getting an MBA, and I ended up going to the Wharton School because they had such a great real estate program. And that's how I ended up there. But I have to say that I tried out a few business classes at the University of Arizona just to make sure that I felt comfortable doing business classes.
Oh, wow. No, thank you for connecting those dots. I just finished Jimmy Carter's more recent book, A Reflection at 90, and he talked about, after he moved out, that was one of the first things is took the solar panels off the White House. So Geez. So let's talk a little bit about some credentials and also your work with the USGBC chapters of the year. So, I mean, first of all, congratulations. You're a LEED fellow. That's amazing. What has that meant for you?
The LEED Fellow is just a wonderful honor. You know, I was in the inaugural class of LEED Fellows, and it just was a great honor to have been recognized in that way. In terms of my work, I'm not sure how much of, I think being a fellow of the American Institute of Architects has been really quite amazing, and also an amazing, amazing honor.
Good. I'm a fellow on both sides, and of course, well AP and other credentials. And then you stayed involved with your chapters as well. So
I was one of the initial people working on development of the chapter. I was, and eventually was on the board for 6 years and chaired/co-chaired the education committee. I couldn't tell you how many years that was maybe 10 or 12 years. And eventually I retired from that. But that was very rewarding, and we really worked hard to have people understand what the opportunities were.
No, thanks for sharing. And so that's a good segue to my question of, hey, if you do look back, Helen, on the highlight reel, what else stands out? What are you really proud of?
Well, as I had mentioned, that article in the biweekly column, and also just having my own business has been amazing. I could say that, there's some projects that I've worked on that were just really wonderful. One of them I might highlight is the first LEED Platinum House of Worship, the Jewish Reconstructionist congregation in Evanston, Illinois. It was designed by Carol Ross Barney, and it was a wonderful project. I loved working with the congregants, in particular the leadership who worked on the project. Very intelligent group of people who really understood those systems. And what happened with that is it propelled that congregation into actually bringing in much higher membership. And one of the very unusual things in that building, and this is really thanks to the president of the congregation at the time, is that the energy model, which normally these energy models aren't necessarily reality. In this particular case, it was pretty darn close. But he, over the next few years, was able to get that building more and more energy efficient simply by watching it and watching how it was performing and making tweaks along the way. And so that was very exciting.
It's very exciting because, sometimes the energy models, unfortunately, are more to document for a LEED project instead of the iterations up front, the what ifs. And then to this point is use it for operations and make sure that this comes true. And how do we really run a better building, especially for, say, a nonprofit? So that is a great story.
Yeah, it really was. I have had a lot of training with energy models. I don't personally do the models, but I understand how they work and always try to get the teams I'm working with to use them as a design tool rather than just a tool, after the fact documentation of LEED. To me, that's almost a waste of time. You might as well not even do it at that time. But if you use it as a design tool, it just can make so much difference.
Absolutely. Well, good. Thank you for taking us back through some highlights. Now let's talk about, the future. What should we be reading up on right now? What do you think's around the corner in this green building?
So, what I read about is net zero energy. I think it's really important. I think that, you got to start with energy efficiency, super energy efficiency, and then use solar or wind or whatever to get to that net zero. People are talking about embodied carbon. Man, we were talking about embodied carbon back in the 70s and 80s. So interesting that it's all of a sudden come back. Healthy materials and indoor environmental quality, these are all things that are bubbling up and coming to the fore, and there's a lot going on. Unfortunately, I think that all of these things are not going to be sufficient to deal with the big existential threat, which is climate change. And so I feel like we as a society need to become more creative and actually develop the will to do the big things that need to be done. And my personal feeling is that technology, while really, really important, is not going to solve the issues with climate change. And it's we're going to have to be looking at other things that relate to human and social development. And one of them, Paul Hawken writes in his book, Carbon Drawdown, is the education of girls in developing countries. And to me, that's one of the most important things.
It's a fantastic book. It's been referenced several times on the podcast. And so we'll make sure we put a link in that in the show notes for sure. I totally agree. You're right. We have to connect the dots and show how it really nets out to still helping on the carbon front.
Also, if you don't mind, I'd like to mention, and that's the idea of regenerative design and development. And I'm sure others have mentioned that too. So I'm actually teaching a class at the Northwestern University, which we call Systems Thinking for Sustainable Design. I feel like it should be Systems Thinking for Regenerative Development, with a co-teach it with another LEED fellow named Michelle Hawley-Stern. Yeah. And we really get our students to think in new ways. And it's a challenge, and it's really fun when all of a sudden they have this aha moment and they go, oh, wow. And so one of our students in particular said it was the most important course that she took during her whole graduate career.
That's fulfilling.
If you don't mind, I wanted to say something about that regeneration. You know, sustainability has become a buzzword, and a lot of us don't know exactly what it means. I'm concerned about that same thing with regeneration and regenerative design. And, when people talk about a sustainable building, I kind of cringe, even though I do it myself on occasion. And I cringe doubly, triply when people talk about a regenerative building.
Is there a good dictionary for how we would define it, and where do we start, right? If it's something we don't know a lot about, it's intimidating and we might not even want to go towards it, but that's not what we need right now. So, from your experience and in your class with regenerative development, while we may not pursue a plaque, maybe a living building is just part of that conversation. Where do you think someone should start if they really want to get up to speed on true regenerative development?
Oh, there are a couple places. One of them would be there's an organization called Regenesis out of Santa Fe that teaches classes on the regenerative practitioner, and I've taken their classes and worked with them for years. And the other is Carol Sanford Institute. She actually works closely with the guys in Santa Fe, Regenesis, and she's written a whole bunch of books on regeneration. And the most recent one is called The Regenerative Life, which is a great book. And so I continue to work with her, and just, it's all about, to me, it's about development, your personal development of communities and ecosystems. And that's why you can't really have a regenerative building, because a building itself doesn't continue to develop, but the community can continue to develop. So you have to be looking at the building as part of a system of wholes, like the building inside the community, inside the larger ecosystem.
Good pro tips there, Helen. Thank you. We'll put links. Those are great resources. And let's talk a little bit more about you. What do you think is your specialty or gift? What are you really good at?
Well, that's an interesting question. One of my specialties, I suppose, is curiosity. I'm just curious about everything, and I'm like to be open and open to new ideas. I always wanted to know what was going on, even as a kid. And I love to travel. I love to see new cultures, experience new things. And I also always love to be on the cutting edge. So worked with people early on who I thought were on the cutting edge. And I'm also committed to education. And I love making connections between people and between ideas.
No, you got to stay curious. Do you give yourself time to think? I know that's something in the busy world that we live in that sometimes there's not as much margin. So, would you mind sharing? I mean, what do you actually schedule time to think? Is there a certain place you do that, or where do you go try to scratch that curiosity itch?
Oh, wow. Well, that's an interesting question. So I love to be out in nature. One of the advantages right now of being in Tucson, Arizona, just for the summer, it's so hot here, but I am so thrilled with watching the desert bloom. We had a big rainfall, and things are coming out that I've never seen before. And so I do some writing. I do like to go hiking and walking, and I try to keep up with what's going on in the world. But you're right. I could benefit, I think, from spending more time thinking and connecting for myself.
You and me both, and all of our guests. I just always like to assemble these best practices, and I think it's important. And so that's a good segue to, do you have any other good habits, routines, rituals? Sounds like you love to get outside and with nature. Anything else you could share? Any good habits?
Well, I was thinking about that, and one of the other things I do, and I keep up on the news every day, and I know it's really depressing, and at the same time, it allows me to see connections and how things are related. Like, how's the pandemic related to climate change? It's a question I keep asking myself, and plan to do some deeper thinking on that, and actually be part of a panel discussion and lead a panel discussion on that very topic.
Yeah, no, it sounds like you need to be aware of what's going on out there, and then how much of that are we going to let influence us? But it's good to know how is it all connected. I like that. As we get to know each other more, Helen, I'm a fan of the bucket list. In other words, what are one or two things that you could share that maybe would be on a bucket list? Any adventure, any travel, write a book? I don't know. What's on the bucket list?
All right. Well, my bucket list is pretty long. One of the items on my bucket list is to write a book on regenerative development to make it more accessible. And we've barely started, but it is in the works. My bigger bucket list, well, I don't know if it's bigger, it's just more intangible because I've been doing it, relates to travel. And I love to travel. I've been to about 50 countries, 48 states, and I want to travel some more. And one of the things that the coronavirus has done is put a big damper on those travel plans. So what have I done? I've created Zoom calls with family all over the world. I have family from Australia to Europe to Ecuador. And so that's been really fun. And one of the things that I think is important for people to understand about bucket lists, one of the places that I traveled to last year was definitely not on my bucket list, and that was Ethiopia. Okay. And I have to say it was one of my favorite trips ever. I just loved that country. It was so beautiful.
Yeah. So maybe it can be stay open to some other adventure. And so where's the first place, though, post-pandemic, Helen, you're going?
I might be going to Portugal. I have that on the calendar. I'm very involved with the American Institute of Architects Europe chapter and go to conferences with them every couple times a year. The other thing I'm really excited about and hope to make something happen with is I support a couple of organizations in a big way. One is called the Hunger Project, and the other is called the Pachamama Alliance. And I really want to go with the Hunger Project to India. I've been with them to Ghana, and they work with rural communities to help them overcome their hopelessness and despair and become self-sufficient. And one of the key elements of their work is the education of women and girls.
Such an important one. And, what you've connected here on this podcast interview is, for those that haven't seen Drawdown, though, that's one of the top 10. I believe it's around number 6 ways that we can reverse climate change. So that's fantastic. Yeah, good. Well, if you end up in Spain, go say hello to my friend Emmanuel in Barcelona, but Portugal sounds wonderful. Let's see. Well, let's talk about books. So you've mentioned a couple. I'll put links to those, but is there another book or two you'd recommend?
Well, if you want to get kind of on the, not so serious side, although it is serious, I just finished reading a book by Isabella Allende. She's one of my favorite authors. The first book she ever wrote was called House of Spirits. It's my all-time favorite. I just finished reading A Long Petal of the Sea. And that book starts with the horrible and bloody civil war in Spain in the 1930s when the fascists and Franco eventually took over.
Oh, wow.
And then the protagonists managed to escape from Spain to Chile, where they created their home and livelihoods. And it kind of spoke to me in the midst of this pandemic because these people were, there was such horribleness and bloodshed. and they got out of it and made a really great life for themselves, and also escaped there was all this civil unrest, and it related in a way to my current fear of fascism. So
yeah, thanks for those books. Those I'll put links, and it's always good to just hear about a book that someone really influenced them. They really enjoyed it. So I'll add that to our list. Well, Helen, as we start to wind down, 2 more questions. One is, okay, looking back on your career, is there anything you wish you'd have known earlier in your career?
Well, I would say if somebody had said to me, don't be afraid to talk to anyone. I wish I had, been less fearful, a little bit more willing to say, you know what, I can talk to anyone about anything. And the other thing that was really important in my life was that, and the advice that I give to young people, if somebody comes to me and says, I want to study sustainability, I would say to them, study something that's fundamental and tangible, something like architecture or engineering. My father would say chemical engineering. And you can use that as a base from which to create a career in sustainability. And the other thing is there are many people, including myself at an early age, who have a hard time choosing. And my advice to them is to just choose something.
Wow, that's really good. Well, and that's good advice for a young professional listening. Yeah, as we wrap up here, if someone's listening and they're just now thinking of maybe a career change or maybe getting out of college, going for it, green building, sustainability, any words of encouragement for them?
Well, I think green building is only going to become more and more important. We talked about climate change, and hundreds of millions of people are going to end up having to be moved away from the rising seas, and we're going to have to be really thinking about green building and smart urban development and all of that. And so there's a huge, huge opportunity in the next 25 to 50 years to do it right. I always believe do it right the first time. And I think that's part of our culture is not, to look at the cheapest way. And I'd like to say, let's look at the best way and the most effective way.
Helen, let's talk about not just books, but even current events. We had a conversation earlier about this. So what else have you been focusing some of your energy on?
So I've also been educating myself about racism, and especially the racist history of our country. Mm-hmm. I am more convinced than ever that we won't create a sustainable world until we create a sustainable society that gives everyone an equal opportunity. And I've been reading a lot about racism, and I want to say that there are many excellent books and articles. I would recommend reading anything by Ta-Nehisi Coates, and also by Toni Morrison, and there's so many others.
We'll link to those, and just in general, I would echo that you're right. We have to get to where we're looking at someone else that we default to. I bet they're just an amazing person instead of something to worry about. A, B, you're right, equal opportunity, and we just have to raise kids that are putting good into this world. It's going to take a combination of those things. And any other thoughts on that front?
Well, one of the things that I've been doing, and I'm a member of a number of organizations, one of which is called CREW, which in Chicago stands for Commercial Real Estate Executive Women of Chicago, and created an initiative on racial equity and social justice. And the enthusiasm for making change is just so palpable right now. And I'm very, very excited to be part of that. And it's just time. I mean, it's been time for generations, but now it's time to make a change.
Absolutely. Well, I've enjoyed getting to know you here. Just congratulations on all your successes. I hope you enjoy the rest of the summer there, and hopefully not too much humidity, but definitely some heat. And I love that with the rain and what's blooming in that desert. And maybe that's just a good, kind of symbolism for what we're going through right now is what does all this make possible? Where are there some opportunities? So I appreciate that encouragement. But everyone, this has been Helen Kessler, LEED Fellow, just a green building expert. Helen, thanks for being on the podcast.
Thank you, Charlie. This was a lot of fun, and I really appreciate your questions and the opportunity to talk to you.
I just want to say thank you to our loyal listeners. We actually are celebrating over 1 year here on the Green Building Matters podcast. Me and the entire team were stoked and just so glad you continue to listen every Wednesday morning to a new interview with a green building professional here in this industry, or just some pro tips that we want to make sure that you are getting straight from us, straight to you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Green Building Matters podcast. At GBES.com, our mission is to advance the green building movement through best-in-class education and encouragement. Remember, you can go to gbes.com/podcast for any notes and links that we mentioned in today's episode. And you can actually see the other episodes that have already been recorded with our amazing guests. Please tell your friends about this podcast. Tell your colleagues. And if you really enjoyed it, leave a positive review on iTunes. Thank you so much, and we'll see you on next week's episode.